So today I thought we'd look a little bit at the biology and importance of white pines in our landscape. So I'm just going to take our camera down and look at some detail down here, and you'll see some parts of pine trees. So a white pine, which is a common type of evergreen in our landscape, is a type of plant that belongs to the biological group called gymnosperms. And gymnosperms are a group of plants that produce pollen but do not produce flowers. So because they don't use pollinators to disperse their pollens, they need to, their pollen is dispersed by the wind. And about a month ago in June, you probably noticed lots and lots of pollen all over the ground, maybe in your house, on your car. That pollen most likely was from the white pine trees that disperse their pollen by wind, and the pollen is produced in these tiny little cones. And a few weeks ago you may have also seen these cones falling to the ground. These tiny little cones, and these are the kind of dried up now, but these tiny little cones are the male pine cones, and the male pine cones are where the pollen is produced, which would have been produced in the upper tips of the pine tree on their branches. About the time that these male pine cones were falling, and the reason why they were falling was the pollen was already dispersed, so they had no other purpose, and they're just lost from the tree. You may have also seen a lot of brown pine needles falling to the ground. No concern. There's not that the pine trees were dying or anything like that. It's just that although pine trees are evergreen trees, so they stay green throughout the winter, they don't lose their needles, they do have to replace their needles. So they'll shed their needles this time of year and then replace them with fresh new green needles. So let's go back to the pollen. The pollen, again, would have been dispersed by all these tiny cones that would have been in the tree. And pollen contains the male reproductive cells, the sperm cells of the plant. So to be able to produce future generations of trees, that pollen has to land on the female part of the plant to fertilize an egg so they can produce a seed and a future embryo which will develop into a pine tree. The female cones, when they're fully mature, are much larger, and you're probably used to seeing something like this, which is from a white pine tree, fall to the ground. When the female pine cones like this, where the eggs would actually be, and so the pollen has to land on them, but when they're forming, they're actually much smaller. And in this piece of pine here that fell to the ground, you can see these green cones here. These are actually developing female cones. So if successful, the pollen would have landed on these cones and fertilized the egg and allow a seed to be formed. However, the seeds and the female cone will actually remain in the tree for about a year. So it won't be until next spring, and unfortunately, because these fell off the tree, they're not going to develop anymore. But on the tree, these cones will take about a year to fully develop, and then next year they'll be much larger and green, and will contain the seeds for the future generations. And you may eventually see them fall to the ground like this cone here. So pine cones, I'm going to see there's a lot of pine cone material here, but each one of these bracts, which is kind of these little scales of the pine cone, I don't know if I can pull it out one-handed because I'm holding the camera at the same time, but if you could pull it out and you look deep inside there, way down in there, there are these kind of two half-moon kind of shaped things, and that's where the seeds would be located. Pine trees are really valuable in our habitat. They provide nesting sites for lots of different animals, squirrels, of course, and lots of different types of birds, including different types of raptors. They also provide a food source for a lot of animals. They'll actually eat the seeds, and you can see here these bracts from the pine cone have been pulled apart, and they're laying here on the ground. In this case, these seeds have actually been eaten by a animal, mostly something like a chipmunk. If you go way down here, the seeds would have been in these areas here. They kind of look, you can see like the shadow of the lighter color where the seeds would have been. But the seeds will get dispersed by animals, and they'll also get dispersed by wind, and wherever they land, if successful, they'll germinate into new pine trees. So white pines and other types of pines and evergreens are really important for our landscape. They provide important nesting habitat for native animals. They provide food. In the winter, they're really important cover for animals to protect them from snow and the winter elements. So admire your pine trees and protect them in your habitat. And also all these needles that have fallen. If you live in a area where there are lots of pine needles, I mean, you can actually rake them up, and they make great mulch for your garden beds. Okay, have a great day.